Welcome to my channel, Sherlock Holmes Stories, Inkwing Audio.
It was, I recall, a particularly vile Tuesday in late November of the year 1894. A dense, yellow fog had settled over London 3 days prior and showed no inclination to lift. It swirled thick against the window panes of 221B Baker Street, dampening the sounds of the hansom cabs outside to a muffled, ghostly rattle, and reducing the gas lamps in the street below to mere nebulous blurs of sickly orange light. The atmosphere inside our sitting room was scarcely less oppressive, though for reasons entirely unconnected to the meteorological conditions. My friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, was in one of his blackest moods. For a week there had been no crime of any note, no features of interest, as he was wont to call the bizarre twists of human depravity that fed his restless intellect. The criminal world of London seemed to have gone into hibernation along with the weather. Holmes had spent the afternoon pacing from the fireplace to the window, his long, thin frame vibrating with nervous energy. He had already rosined the bow of his violin 3 times without playing a note, and I watched with growing trepidation as his gaze drifted increasingly toward the Morocco case on the mantelpiece, the repository of his gleaming syringe and the 7% solution that I so dreaded as a medical man. "It is intolerable, Watson," he snapped, throwing himself into his armchair and striking a match to light his cherrywood pipe, only to let it go out immediately. "The mind stagnates, the gears seize. I require a challenge, a tangle to unknot, something to save me from this crushing ennui of existence." I lowered my copy of the British Medical Journal. Surely, Holmes, the recent affair of the Vatican cameos, trifles, child's play. He waved a dismissive hand, the smoke from his rekindled pipe wreathing his aquiline features. The Pope himself could have solved that with half an hour's concentration. "No, Watson, what I need is the impossible, the inexplicable." As if fate itself had decided to answer his challenge, a sharp, frantic tug at the street doorbell below echoed through the house. It was not the ring of a casual visitor, nor a delivery. It was a clarion call of distress. Holmes's lethargy vanished in an instant. He leaned forward, his grey eyes shining through the haze of smoke, his head cocked like a terrier hearing a rat in the wainscoting. "Interest appears to be arriving on the doorstep, Watson, and in a singular hurry." A moment later, Mrs. Hudson opened the door to admit a man who looked as though he had run every yard from Kensington. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in the immaculate frock coat and silk hat of a professional gentleman, yet his appearance was utterly dishevelled. His cravat was askew. Beads of sweat stood out upon his pale forehead despite the November chill, and his chest heaved with exertion. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" the visitor gasped, clutching the doorframe for support. "I am he," Holmes said, rising smoothly, "and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. Pray take the basket chair near the fire. You are shivering, Mr. Crompton. Alistair Crompton," the man breathed, collapsing into the offered seat. "A barrister of considerable standing, I perceive," Holmes observed coolly, handing the man a glass of brandy I had quickly poured. "Recently involved in the lengthy probate dispute concerning the estate of Lord Harrington, and currently suffering from a severe shock that challenges your rigidity of logic." Crompton stared at Holmes over the rim of the glass, a flicker of amazement cutting through his panic. "Good God, sir, how could you possibly know all that? Your forefinger and thumb are stained with the distinctive purple ink used in the royal courts of justice." Holmes explained impatiently. "The Harrington probate is the only case currently running long enough to produce the specific wear on the document bag you clutched so tightly. The leather on the handle is frayed unevenly to the left, suggesting a heavy asymmetrical load carried daily over weeks. As for the shock, your dilated pupils and erratic respiration speak for themselves. Now drink your brandy and tell us precisely what has occurred." Alistair Crompton gulped the spirit and set the glass down with a clatter. He seemed to gather his fractured composure, the trained legal mind attempting to assert order over chaos. "Mr. Holmes, I have come to you because what has happened is impossible. It defies every law of physics and reason. If I were not a man of sound mind, I would believe myself victim to a hallucination." "Facts, Mr. Crompton," Holmes urged, leaning back and putting his fingertips together. "Data. I cannot make bricks without clay." "Very well," Crompton began, his voice shaking slightly. "I reside in a modest but secure house in South Kensington. My most prized possession, indeed a sacred trust placed in my care by a client, is the Codex of St. Jude. It is an 8th century illuminated manuscript, priceless beyond measure, containing secrets that could, well, that is immaterial to the theft itself." Holmes nodded, his eyes narrowed. "Go on." "I keep the Codex in my study. It is a fortress, Mr. Holmes. The room is on the 2nd floor. There is only one door, heavy oak, fitted with a Bramah lock and a separate deadbolt, both of which I engage whenever I leave the room. The single window is barred with iron from the outside and overlooks a sheer drop to a paved courtyard 40 feet below. The fireplace chimney is narrow. I have had it measured, and it would not admit a small child, let alone a man." The barrister paused, taking a shuddering breath. "This evening, at 7 o'clock, I locked the Codex in its display cabinet within the study. I then left the room to dine, double-locking the study door behind me and placing the keys in my waistcoat pocket. I swear to you, they never left my person. I dined alone. The servants were all in the basement kitchen. At 8 o'clock, 1 hour later, I returned." He leaned forward, his face a mask of terror. "Mr. Holmes, the door was still locked, the deadbolt was engaged, I used my own keys to enter, the window bars were untouched, the chimney soot was undisturbed, but the glass cabinet was shattered and the Codex of St. Jude was gone." Holmes sat in silence for some moments, the only sound in the room being the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece and the soft hiss of the gaslight. He had closed his eyes, his head resting against the back of the chair, his long, thin fingers joined at the tips in his characteristic attitude of intense concentration. To an outsider, he might have appeared to be dozing, but I knew better. The great detective was currently constructing a mental map of Alistair Crompton's study, rotating the locked room in his mind like a complex geometric puzzle. "You are certain of the chimney, Mr. Crompton?" Holmes asked suddenly, his eyes snapping open. "The dimensions, I mean. A man of slight build, perhaps, a gymnast or a boy." "I had it swept and inspected only last month, Mr. Holmes," Crompton replied, his voice gaining a measure of steadiness as he spoke to a professional. "The flue narrows to a mere 7 inches by 9 at the throat. A cat might find it a tight squeeze, a human being would find it a tomb. And the window. As I said, iron bars bolted into the masonry of the house itself. I checked them myself after the discovery. They are as solid as the day they were forged." Holmes leaned forward, a lean, predatory look upon his face. "The fascination of this case, Watson," he said, addressing me rather than our client, "lies in its stark simplicity. We are not dealing with a whodunit yet, but a how on earth could it be done? When you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. But here the improbable seems to have vanished along with the impossible." He turned back to Crompton. "Tell me, Mr. Crompton, how many people in your household knew of the Codex's value?" "Only my valet, Stevens, and perhaps my housekeeper, Mrs. Marbury. But they are both of 20 years' service. I would trust them with my life." "Trust is a luxury the investigator can ill afford," Holmes remarked dryly. He rose and paced the length of the rug, his eyes scanning the floor as if the answer might be written in the patterns of our own carpet. Suddenly, he stopped before Crompton and peered closely at the man's left sleeve. "I see that you have recently dismissed your carriage groom, Mr. Crompton, and have taken to brushing your own coats, with somewhat indifferent success." The barrister blinked, momentarily derailed by the shift in topic. Yes, that is true. Old Miller retired last week. But how? The nap of your sleeve is brushed against the grain, and there are several stray hairs from a stiff-bristled clothes brush that no trained servant would have left behind. Furthermore, Holmes added, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips, you had a slight altercation with a dog on your way here, a Dandy Dinmont Terrier, if I am not mistaken. Crompton gasped. It is uncanny. A neighbour's dog nipped at my heels as I ran for a hansom. But what has that to do with the Codex? Directly? Probably nothing, Holmes admitted, his eyes dancing with a sharp, intellectual mischievousness. But it serves as a reminder that the smallest details, a misplaced hair, a disturbed nap, a frantic neighbour's dog, are the alphabet from which we compose the language of truth. If I can see the history of your afternoon on your sleeve, imagine what your study will tell me. He turned to the corner and retrieved his heavy ulster and his deerstalker cap. The game is afoot, Watson. The fog is thick, the night is young, and we have a locked room that refuses to yield its secrets. I suggest we take a hansom to South Kensington immediately. I am anxious to see this fortress of yours. As I donned my own overcoat and checked my service revolver, a habit from my Afghan days that I could never quite shake when Holmes was in a certain state of agitation, I watched my friend. The black melancholy that had gripped him only an hour ago had evaporated entirely. He was now a man possessed by a singular cold fire. Tell me, Mr. Crompton, Holmes said as we descended the 17 steps to the street, does the name the Black Friar mean anything to you? Crompton paused on the landing, his face paling even further in the dim light of the hallway. The Black Friar? No. Why do you ask? Because, Holmes replied, his voice dropping to a low, resonant tone, the Codex of St. Jude was once the property of a monastic order that bore that name. And they were famous for one thing above all else, their ability to move through walls as though they were made of mist. I felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the London winter. As we stepped out into the swirling yellow gloom of Baker Street, the mystery of the locked door seemed to loom over us, as impenetrable and suffocating as the fog itself. The handsome ride to South Kensington was a silent affair, punctuated only by the rhythmic clatter of hooves upon the damp cobblestones and the occasional sharp cry of a link boy guiding a carriage through the impenetrable gloom. Holmes sat shrouded in his cloak, his chin sunk upon his chest, lost in that profound state of mental synthesis which I had learned never to interrupt. For my part, I turned over the facts of the case in my mind. A double-locked door, a barred window, a chimney too narrow for a child, and yet a priceless manuscript had vanished in a mere 60 minutes. It was a problem of pure logic, and yet it felt stained with the supernatural. Mr. Crompton's residence was a tall, sombre edifice of grey stone, its facade partially obscured by the swirling mist. Upon our arrival, we were met by Stevens, the valet, a man whose silvered hair and trembling hands spoke of a lifetime of faithful service, now shattered by scandal. He led us up a wide, carpeted staircase to the second floor, stopping before a formidable door of dark, seasoned oak. "The room has been kept exactly as I found it, Mr. Holmes," Crompton whispered, his voice echoing in the narrow corridor. "I have forbidden the servants from so much as crossing the threshold." Holmes nodded in approval. He did not immediately enter. Instead, he dropped to his knees in the hallway, whipping his magnifying glass from his pocket. To the bewildered eyes of Crompton and Stevens, he appeared more like a man searching for a lost sixpence than a world-renowned investigator. He scrutinized the door frame, the hinges, and the heavy brass keyhole of the Brahma lock with the intensity of a jeweler examining a flawed diamond. "Not a scratch," he murmured, rising to his feet. "The lock has not been picked, nor the wood marring the bolt. The door was indeed opened with its own key, or not opened at all." He stepped into the room, and I followed close behind. The study was a sanctuary of erudition. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls filled with leather-bound volumes that smelled of old parchment and dust. In the center stood a massive mahogany desk, and against the far wall, beneath the heavily barred window, sat the display cabinet. It was a gruesome sight for any collector. The velvet-lined interior of the cabinet, which had held the Codex of St. Jude, was now littered with jagged shards of glass. The heavy crystal pane had been shattered completely. "Note the distribution of the glass, Watson," Holmes said, gesturing with a long, thin hand. I leaned forward, trying to apply my friend's methods. "The majority of the fragments are inside the cabinet, Holmes. That would suggest the blow came from the outside." "Excellent, Watson. You see, but you do not observe," he remarked, though his tone was absent of its usual bite. He was already moving toward the window. He gripped the iron bars and shook them with surprising strength. They remained rooted in the masonry, as immovable as the house itself. He then turned his attention to the fireplace, thrusting his head into the aperture and peering upward. When he emerged, a single smudge of soot marked his high forehead. "The flue is indeed narrow," he mused. "But look here." He pointed to the hearth. A small white object lay near the fender. I picked it up. It was a tiny, translucent flake, no larger than a fish scale, yet it felt oddly waxy to the touch. "A piece of paraffin wax?" I suggested. "Perhaps from a candle?" "Perhaps," Holmes said, his eyes scanning the floor. He began a systematic search of the carpet, crawling on all fours, his nose inches from the pile. He ignored the shattered cabinet entirely now, focusing instead on a heavy Persian rug that sat near the center of the room. He plucked something from the fibers, a short, stiff hair, dark in color. "Aha! What do you make of this, Mr. Crompton?" The barrister peered at the hair. I cannot say. It looks like a common animal hair. Stevens, do we have a cat?" "No, sir," the valet replied nervously. "No pets of any kind." Holmes placed the hair and the waxy flake into a small glass envelope. His movements were now brisk and electric. He walked over to the desk and examined a series of invitation cards tucked into the frame of a blotter. "You have a wide circle of acquaintances, Mr. Crompton. I see a card here from a Mr. Julian Vane, dated 3 days ago. The pleasure of your company for a private viewing. Does Mr. Vane share your interest in antiquities?" "Julian?" Crompton seemed startled. "He's a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, yes." "A brilliant man, though somewhat eccentric. He was here only yesterday morning to discuss the Codex." "But surely you don't suspect—" "I suspect nothing yet," Holmes interrupted, his gaze fixed on the heavy oak door. "I am merely collecting the bricks. The building of the theory comes later. However," he added, turning to me with a singular glint in his eye, "I find it most interesting, Watson, that while the room was locked from the outside, the dust on the top of the doorframe has been disturbed in a very specific lateral pattern. I looked up, but saw nothing but a thin grey layer of London grime." Holmes, however, looked as though he had just found a map to a hidden treasure. He pulled out his watch and clicked the case shut. "We have seen enough for tonight, Crompton. Secure this room. Let no one enter, not even yourself. Watson and I shall return to Baker Street to consult my monographs. There is a thread here, and if I pull it, I believe the entire tapestry of this impossible theft will unravel." As we descended the stairs, I noticed Holmes was sniffing the air, a deep, searching inhalation. "Do you smell it, Watson?" he whispered as we stepped back into the fog. "The damp, the coal smoke?" "No," Holmes replied, his voice trailing off into the yellow mist. "The faint, unmistakable scent of incense, the kind used only in the high altars of the Mediterranean. The Black Friars are closer than I thought." The following morning, the yellow fog had thinned to a ghostly pearl grey, though the air remained bitingly cold. I awoke to find Holmes already at work, his tall, thin form enveloped in a dressing gown of mouse-coloured flannel. The room was a chaos of open reference volumes and chemical charts. On the small table beside him sat a microscope, and he was currently peering through it at the tiny, waxy flake he had retrieved from Mr. Crompton's hearth. "A most singular substance, Watson," he remarked, without looking up. "Not common paraffin at all, but a sophisticated blend of spermaceti and a very rare resin found only in the Levant. It is used primarily in the preservation of ancient vellum. Our thief did not merely steal the codex. He, or it, was intimately familiar with the requirements of its survival. Before I could question him further, the heavy tread of a familiar footstep sounded on the stairs. A moment later, Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard burst into the room, his small, rat-like face flushed with a mixture of exertion and professional triumph. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he cried, tossing his bowler hat onto the settee, "I think we can mark this one as closed, a quick bit of work even by my standards." Holmes arched a thin eyebrow. "Indeed, Lestrade, you have solved the mystery of the locked room in under 12 hours. My congratulations. Pray, enlighten us." Lestrade smirked, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. "It's the old story, Holmes. Look for the man with the motive and the means. We've had our eye on Julian Vane for some time. He's a gentleman, or was one, but his gambling debts at the Diogenes Club are the talk of the town. He was at Crompton's house the morning before the theft. He knew exactly where the codex was kept." "And the locked door?" I asked. "The barred window?" "Simplicity itself, Doctor," Lestrade said, turning to me. "Vane bribed the valet, Stevens. We searched Stevens's quarters an hour ago and found 20 sovereigns hidden in a boot tree. Stevens had a duplicate key made weeks ago. He let Vane into the study while Crompton was at dinner. Vane broke the glass, took the book, and Stevens locked the door behind him after Vane had slipped out. The impossible part was just a bit of theatre to confuse the old barrister. And the bars on the window? The undisturbed soot in the chimney?" Holmes asked, his voice deceptively mild. "Irrelevant," Lestrade waved a hand dismissively. "The door was the way in. The duplicate key explains everything. I have a warrant for Vane's arrest in my pocket. We found a shard of crystal glass in the turn-up of his trousers that matches the display cabinet perfectly." Holmes rose and walked to the window, staring out at the grey London sky. "It is a beautiful theory, Lestrade. It is neat, it is logical, and it accounts for the sovereigns in the valet's boot. Then you agree?" "I agree that it is too beautiful," Holmes snapped, turning around with a sudden, fierce energy. "It is a theory that has been handed to you on a silver salver. Consider, if Stevens were clever enough to assist in a high-stakes theft, would he be foolish enough to hide the blood money in his own quarters? If Vane were meticulous enough to plan a locked-room mystery, would he walk about with the evidence of a broken cabinet in the cuffs of his trousers? No, no, Lestrade, this is not the work of a desperate gambler and a trembling valet. This is a stage-managed performance designed specifically for your benefit." Lestrade's face darkened. "It's all very well to talk, Holmes, but I have the money and I have the glass." "What do you have?" "I have a hair from a Himalayan langur," Holmes replied, picking up a slide from his table, "and the lingering scent of kaifi, an incense used by the ancient priesthoods of Egypt, and maintained by the more esoteric branches of the Black Friars. I also have the curious fact that the dust on the top of the door frame was moved sideways, which no key, duplicate or otherwise, could ever achieve." Lestrade snorted. "Monks and monkeys. Really, Holmes, I'll stick to my warrant. Vane will be in the Newgate cells by nightfall." As the inspector marched out of the room, Holmes turned to me, his eyes glowing with that cold, inward light that signaled his mind was working at its highest capacity. "Lestrade is a fool, Watson, but a useful one. His arrest will give the real culprit a false sense of security. But we must act quickly. The Black Friar is no ghost, but he is certainly no ordinary thief. Tell me, do you still have that heavy walking stick of yours? The one with the lead-weighted head? "I do," I replied, feeling a familiar surge of adrenaline. "Good. Fetch it. We are going to pay a visit to the London Zoological Gardens. I wish to have a word with the keeper of the primates. If my theory holds, the locked door was never a barrier at all, provided one has the right kind of accomplice. The London Zoological Gardens in Regent's Park were a dismal sight under the grey, weeping sky. The paths were nearly deserted, and the exotic cries of caged beasts sounded particularly mournful in the damp air. Holmes, however, strode through the gardens with a briskness that suggested he was on the scent of a fox. He led me directly to the primate house, where the air was heavy with the musk of sawdust and wild animals. "Mr. Higgins?" Holmes called out, approaching a burly man in a stained canvas apron who was busy scrubbing a water trough. The man looked up, squinting through the dim light. "Aye, that's me. And who might you be?" "My name is Sherlock Holmes. I believe you had a small security lapse 3 nights ago, a temporary disappearance from the Himalayan enclosure." Higgins's face turned a mottled purple. "How did you—" "Look here, sir. The director said it wasn't to be made public. It was only for a few hours. The creature came back on its own, didn't it? A Himalayan langur, if I am not mistaken," Holmes said, ignoring the man's protests. "A particularly small specimen, perhaps young or stunted." "Siddhartha," Higgins muttered, leaning on his brush. "Smallest langur I've ever seen. Clever as a Christian, too. Someone must have picked the lock on his cage, but why anyone would steal a monkey only to let him back in by dawn is more than I can fathom. Did you notice anything unusual about the monkey upon its return?" Higgins scratched his head. "Well, now you mention it, the little beast smelled like a funeral. All sweet and heavy. Incense," the vet said, "and he had a bit of blue silk thread caught in his claws." Holmes's eyes flashed with triumph. He turned to me, his face illuminated by a sudden ray of pale sunlight filtering through the glass roof. "You see, Watson? The pieces begin to form a pattern. The Black Friar does not walk through walls, he simply employs those who can climb them. As we left the zoo and hailed a hansom, I felt the familiar frustration of being steps behind my friend. I see the monkey, Holmes. I see the how of the shattered cabinet. But the room, the bars were solid, the chimney was impossible, and the door was locked from the outside. Even a monkey cannot pass through solid oak." "Correct, Watson. It cannot. And yet the dust on top of the doorframe was moved sideways. Think. If the door were opened by a key, the top edge of the door would swing in an arc. The dust would be disturbed in a curve, or not at all. But a lateral disturbance suggests the door was moved in a plane parallel to the frame. I don't follow." "You will," Holmes said cryptically, leaning back and closing his eyes. "We must revisit Mr. Crompton's house. There is one detail I missed, a detail that the Black Friar counted on everyone missing because it is so blindingly obvious. When we arrived back at the South Kensington residence, Crompton met us in the hall. He looked haggard, his eyes red-rimmed. "Lestrade has arrested Julian Vane," he said hollowly. "He tells me the case is solved. But the codex, it has not been recovered." "Lestrade is hunting a phantom," Holmes said shortly. "Allow us into the study once more." Inside the room, Holmes did not look at the cabinet or the window. Instead, he went straight to the heavy oak door. He knelt, examining the massive brass hinges. Then he took a small, sharp penknife from his pocket and scraped at the dark, old-fashioned paint on the doorframe, just above the upper hinge. A thin sliver of bright, unoxidized steel was revealed. "Aha!" Holmes whispered. "The secret clue, Watson. The inconsistency that destroys the locked room illusion. I peered at the steel. It looks like a pin, Holmes. It is a retractable hinge pin, Watson, a masterwork of mechanical deception. This door was designed to be removed entirely from its frame without ever touching the lock or the bolt. The Black Friar did not need a key. He simply slid the pins, lifted the door aside, sent his small, incense-scented accomplice in to shatter the glass and retrieve the codex, and then replaced the door as if it had never been moved. "But Crompton was at dinner," I cried. "He would have heard the glass break, would he?" Holmes pointed to the heavy Persian rug I had seen earlier. The cabinet was moved onto the rug before the glass was broken, muffling the sound. And as for the timing, he picked up a small discarded scrap of paper from the wastebasket, a simple receipt for a clockmaker. "Mr. Crompton, was your study clock recently repaired?" "Why, yes," Crompton said, startled. "By a new man. A recommendation from Julian Vane, ironically. A recommendation that gave the thief access to this room for measurements," Holmes muttered. "But there is one thing that still bothers me, Watson, the languor. Why use a monkey at all if you have already bypassed the door? Why not simply walk in?" He stood up, his brow furrowed in a deep fifth, unless the room was not empty when the theft occurred. Before I could ask what he meant, a sharp, rhythmic tapping sounded from the window. We all turned. There, silhouetted against the barred glass, was a small, dark shape with glowing eyes. It was the langueur, and it was holding something in its small, leather-like hand, a note sealed with black wax. The creature's appearance was so sudden and so grotesque that Crompton let out a strangled cry, retreating toward the shadow of his bookshelves. The langueur sat perched upon the outer sill, its long, spindly fingers wrapped around the iron bars. It chattered once, a sharp, mocking sound, and dropped a small scroll of parchment through the gap before vanishing into the swirling yellow abyss of the fog. Holmes was at the window in a heartbeat, his arm thrust through the bars in a vain attempt to catch the beast, but it was gone, leaving only the scent of that cloying, ancient incense behind. He retrieved the parchment, his fingers trembling with a suppressed electrical energy. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked, stepping closer. "A ransom demand?" Holmes unrolled the paper. His face, usually as impassive as an ivory carving, tightened. He did not read the message aloud. Instead, he turned and began to pace the room with a frantic, uneven stride. He stopped at the mahogany desk, swept a pile of legal briefs onto the floor with a clatter, and began to draw a series of rapid intersecting lines on a blank sheet of paper. "Silence, Watson! Silence, Crompton!" he snapped when the barrister attempted to speak. "The proportions are wrong. The Euclidean geometry of this house is being subverted by a mind that understands the fourth dimension better than the third." He suddenly dropped to his knees and began measuring the distance from the broken cabinet to the door with his pocket tape, muttering calculations in what sounded like a mixture of Latin and chemical formulae. His eyes had a wild, glazed brilliance, and he ignored my hand when I reached out to check his pulse. To any casual observer, he would have seemed to have lost his reason entirely. "The note, Holmes," I persisted, my concern for his mental state growing. "What did the message say?" He threw the parchment at me without looking up from his measurements. It was thick, vellum-like paper, and the ink was a dark, brownish red. The message was brief. "The Codex of St. Jude has returned to the shadows of the altar. He who seeks the friar seeks his own grave. The sacrifice has already begun." "The sacrifice," I whispered. "What can that—" A piercing, blood-curdling shriek from the floor below cut through the air, vibrating the very floorboards beneath our feet. It was a cry of absolute primal terror, ending in a sickening, gurgling thud. "Stevens!" Crompton cried, recognizing the voice of his valet. We raced from the room, Holmes leading the way with a speed that left me breathless. We reached the first-floor landing, just as the heavy doors to the dining hall swung open. There, slumped across the threshold of the service pantry, lay the valet. I knelt beside him instantly, my medical training taking over. Stevens was alive, but only just. His face was a mask of greyish blue, and his hands were clawing at his throat. There was no mark of violence upon him, no blood, no bruising, yet his lungs seemed to be seizing in a titanic struggle for air. "Cyanosis," I muttered. "He's suffocating, but the airway is clear." Holmes did not assist me. Instead, he stood over us, his head tilted back, sniffing the air like a hound. "Do not touch his lips, Watson," he barked. "The scent! It is the kyphi again, but concentrated. It is a vaporous alkaloid, a poison of the breath." He suddenly turned away from the dying man and began striking the walls of the hallway with the head of his cane, listening for hollow echoes. He was ignoring the human tragedy at his feet, in favor of the architecture. "Holmes, the man is dying," I shouted, outraged by his apparent coldness. "He is already dead, Watson, whether his heart beats or not," Holmes replied, his voice chillingly detached. "Look at his eyes." I looked. Stevens's pupils were not dilated as they had been in the study. They were constricted to mere pinpricks, and a thin white film was rapidly forming over the corneas. It was a symptom I had never encountered in any medical text. Suddenly, Holmes stopped his tapping. He had reached a large ornamental mirror in the hall. He did not look at his reflection. He threw his entire weight against the frame. With a groan of protested wood and a click of a hidden spring, the entire section of the wall, mirror and all, swung inward to reveal a dark, yawning cavity. "The rising stakes, Watson!" Holmes cried, his voice bordering on a manic laugh. "The house is not a fortress, it is a honeycomb. And while Lestrade sits in a cell with Julian Vane, the Black Friar is standing exactly 3 feet behind us." I spun around, my hand flying to my revolver, but the hallway behind us was empty, save for the flickering shadows of the gaslights and the gasping form of the valet. "Not in the flesh, Watson," Holmes whispered, his erratic energy suddenly replaced by a terrifying cold stillness. "But in the intent. We are being hunted in a house of mirrors. Mr. Crompton, I suggest you stay very close to the doctor's pistol. The second act of this tragedy has begun, and the thief is no longer satisfied with books." The atmosphere in the house had shifted from one of academic mystery to a palpable, breathing dread. Stevens had been carried to his room, where he lay in a state of deathly catatonia, while Alistair Crompton sat huddled in the library, his spirit broken by the transformation of his home into a death trap. Holmes, however, was a man transformed. The erratic pacing and wild outbursts of the previous hour had vanished, replaced by a cold, terrifyingly precise industry. "Watson," he said, his voice a sharp whisper as we stood before the dark aperture behind the mirror. "The Black Friar is a creature of habit and ritual. He has used the langur to fetch, the hinge pins to enter, and the kyphi to silence. But his greatest weapon is the illusion of the impossible. He believes he has turned this house into a temple where he is the only god. It is time we introduced a second deity to the pantheon." "What are you planning, Holmes? If the man is in those walls, he is not merely in the walls, Watson. He is the architect of our current predicament. Now, listen closely. I require you to take Mr. Crompton and depart. Go to the nearest chemist, not the one on the corner, but the one in Sloane Street. Demand a very specific list of reagents, crystallized belladonna, a drachm of phosphorus, and a pint of pure grain alcohol. Make a great deal of noise about it. Ensure the hansom driver hears your destination. Most importantly, leave me here, alone. "I will do no such thing," I protested, my hand tightening on my cane. "To leave you in this state, in this house, with a phantom killer. It is not a request, Watson, it is a prescription," Holmes snapped, though a brief flash of the old warmth crossed his eyes. "The thief is watching. He needs to believe I am reaching the point of desperate chemical experimentation, that I am cornered and unhinged. If he thinks I am vulnerable, he will move to complete the sacrifice mentioned in the note. Now go. Every second you linger is a second he uses to sharpen his blade." Reluctantly, I did as he commanded. I practically dragged the trembling Crompton to a hansom, shouting instructions to the driver with a theatricality that felt absurd given the gravity of the situation. As we pulled away into the fog, I looked back at the house. A single light flickered in the upper window of the study. Holmes, silhouetted against the glass, his movements jerky and strange, as if he were performing some occult rite. We reached the chemist, but my mind was not on the belladonna. I waited precisely 20 minutes, the time Holmes had calculated it would take for a watcher to assume we were occupied, and then, leaving Crompton under the watchful eye of the chemist's assistant, I slipped out the back door. I moved through the back alleys of South Kensington with the stealth of a skirmisher. When I reached the rear of Crompton's estate, I found the small wooden gate to the servants' courtyard slightly ajar. I crept toward the house, my heart hammering against my ribs. Inside, the house was silent, a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to swallow the sound of my breathing. I moved toward the dining hall, my revolver drawn. As I neared the secret passage behind the mirror, I smelled it, the thick, cloying scent of the Kai-Fi incense rising like a fog from the hidden depths of the wall. Suddenly, a low, rhythmic chanting began to echo through the house. It was a dissonant, haunting sound, punctuated by the sharp chatter of the langur. I peered around the corner of the mirror frame. The secret passage was no mere crawl space. It was a narrow gallery, lined with stolen ecclesiastical treasures. And there, at the end of the passage, was Holmes. He was slumped in a chair, his head lolling to one side, a small burner at his feet, emitting clouds of blue-tinged smoke. Standing over him was a figure that seemed to have stepped out of a medieval nightmare. It was draped in the heavy, soot-stained robes of a monk, the cowl pulled low to hide its face. In its right hand, it held a curved sacrificial knife. In its left, it clutched the Codex of St. Jude. The logic of the great detective ends in the smoke of the altar, the figure hissed, its voice a raspy, cultivated growl. You sought the friar, Mr. Holmes. Now, you shall join the saints. The knife was raised. I stepped forward, my finger on the trigger, but before I could cry out a warning, the slumped figure of Holmes moved with the speed of a striking cobra. His hand shot out, grasping the monk's wrist with a grip of steel. At the same moment, the smoke from the burner changed color from blue to a blinding, brilliant white. On the contrary, Vicar, Holmes's voice rang out, clear and mocking as he stood up, perfectly unaffected by the fumes. I find that logic is the only thing that survives the transition from the shadows to the light. Watson, secure the langur, if you please. I believe our Black Friar is about to lose his habit. The struggle was brief but decisive. With a sharp twist of the wrist, Holmes sent the sacrificial blade clattering across the stone floor of the hidden gallery. I stepped forward, my revolver leveled at the chest of the hooded figure, while the langur, sensing the change in fortune, retreated into the shadows of the rafters, hissing in frustration. The game is at an end, Reverend, Holmes said, his voice ringing with a cold judicial authority. Or should I call you Mr. Thorne, the clockmaker? Or perhaps, as your former congregation in Devon knew you, the apostle of the abyss? With a swift motion, Holmes reached forward and tore the soot-stained cowl from our captive's head. I gasped in surprise. The face revealed was not that of a stranger, nor was it the scholarly Julian Vane. It was the new man Crompton had mentioned, the clockmaker who had recently serviced the study's timepiece. He was a man of middle age, with a high intellectual forehead and eyes that burned with a feverish fanatic light. Silas Thorne, I whispered, recognizing the name from a scandal that had rocked the clerical world years prior. Precisely, Watson, Holmes said, stepping back and casually brushing a speck of dust from his sleeve. A man of great mechanical skill and even greater religious delusion. He believed the Codex of St. Jude contained the formula for a divine breath, the very alkaloid he used to silence poor Stevens. Thorne snarled, his hands shackled in the heavy iron grip Holmes had applied. The Codex belongs to the faithful. It was stolen from the Order centuries ago. I have merely restored it to its rightful altar, by way of a monkey and a set of retractable hinge pins, Holmes remarked dryly. Hardly the work of Providence, I should think. At that moment, the sounds of heavy boots echoed from the hallway. Inspector Lestrade appeared at the mouth of the secret passage, looking bewildered and not a little sheepish as he took in the scene, the hidden room, the bound monk, and the priceless manuscript clutched in Holmes's hand. "Mr. Holmes," Lestrade stammered, we have vein in the cells. We found the glass which Mr. Thorne here planted in the poor man's trousers when he accidentally bumped into him at the Diogenes Club." Holmes interrupted. "And the sovereigns in Stevens's boot? Thorne placed them there while repairing the grandfather clock in the hall. It was a masterful piece of misdirection, Lestrade, designed to play upon your penchant for the obvious." Lestrade flushed. "And the locked door? The bars?" "Look here, Inspector," Holmes said, gesturing to the heavy oak door that led back into the study. "I observed yesterday that the dust on the top frame had been moved laterally. No key could do that. I then found the traces of fresh oil and the bright steel of a modified hinge pin. Thorne did not need a key because he did not use the lock. He simply removed the entire door from its hinges, entered the room and used his trained accomplice, the langur, to shatter the display case from the inside by dropping a lead weight from the ceiling beam, which explains why the glass was distributed as it was." "But why the monkey?" I asked. "If he could move the door, why not simply step inside?" "Because, Watson, as I suspected during our first visit, the room was not empty. Mr. Crompton, in his agitation, had forgotten that his aged aunt was dozing in the wing chair by the fire, her back to the cabinet. A man's footsteps would have woken her, the soft, padded feet of a langur, descending from the secret ceiling hatch Thorne had rediscovered, did not. Thorne manipulated the door from the secret passage, sent the monkey in to retrieve the book, and replaced the door before the aunt even stirred from her nap." Holmes turned to Thorne, his expression one of grim satisfaction. "You used the legend of the Black Friars to mask your movements, utilizing the secret passages of this house, which was built upon the foundations of a 14th-century priory. You knew the architecture better than the owner. But you made one fatal error." Thorne looked up, his face a mask of hatred. "And what was that?" "The kaifi," Holmes replied. "You are a scholar of the ancient world, but you forgot that I am a scholar of tobacco and chemistry. The specific resin you used in your incense leaves a microscopic blue residue when burned. When I saw that same blue thread in the langur's claws at the zoo, I knew the Black Friar was no ghost, but a man with access to a very specific apothecary." As Lestrade's men led Thorne away, Holmes handed the Codex of St. Jude back to a stunned Alistair Crompton. "Your locked door is now a matter of public record, Mr. Crompton," Holmes said. "I suggest you have those hinges welded shut and your chimneys swept for more than just soot. The bustle that follows a successful capture by Scotland Yard is always of a particular flavour, a mixture of official self-importance and the frantic scribbling of notebooks." As Silas Thorne was led away in irons, his face still twisted in a mask of fanatical defiance, the silent house in South Kensington suddenly teemed with a heavy-booted presence of the law. Julian Vane was released from the Newgate cells within the hour, following a curt and somewhat embarrassed telegram from Lestrade. The young gentleman, I later heard, was quite vociferous in his demands for an apology, though I suspect the restoration of his reputation among the members of the Diogenes Club was a more pressing concern than any official contrition from the Yard. My first duty, however, was to Stevens. The valet had been moved to a sunlit guest room where the air was fresh and free of the cloying scent of kaifi. Under my care, the effects of the vaporous alkaloid began to recede. It was, as Holmes had surmised, a derivative of a rare Egyptian nightshade designed to induce a state of suspended animation, a living death that Thorne had used to simulate the touch of the supernatural. By the following afternoon, Stevens was sitting up, though he still looked at the shadows in the corners of the room with a lingering trepidation that no medicine could fully cure. Alistair Crompton, for his part, seemed a man who had aged 10 years in a single night. The Codex of St. Jude sat once again upon his desk, but the cabinet was gone. replaced by a modern safe of solid iron that looked distinctly out of place amidst the elegant Victorian furnishings. "I owe you a debt that transcends mere professional fees, Mr. Holmes," Crompton said as we prepared to take our leave. He held the ancient vellum manuscript with a reverence that bordered on fear. "To think that I was living in a house of secrets, surrounded by the very man who sought to destroy me." "You were living in a house of history, Mr. Crompton," Holmes replied, pulling on his gloves. "The mistake was in believing that the past is ever truly buried. Silas Thorne did not create those secret passages, he merely remembered them. I suggest you consult a good architect before you sleep another night under this roof." As we stepped out into the crisp evening air, the yellow fog had finally lifted, replaced by a cold, clear sky in which the stars shone with a wintry brilliance. We hailed a hansom and began our journey back to Baker Street. "It was the lateral dust, Holmes," I said after a long silence. "That was the pivot upon which the entire case turned. I am still astonished that such a minute detail could betray a man's entire stratagem." Holmes leaned back, the flare of a match illuminating his sharp features as he lit a cigarette. "Small is a relative term, Watson. To a man of law, the dust is a nuisance. To a man of science, it is a record of movement. Thorne was a master of the mechanical, but he was a slave to his own cleverness. He assumed that because the door was locked, no one would think to look at the hinges. It is a common failing of the criminal mind to protect the front door while leaving the back gate unlatched." "And the monkey, Siddhartha?" "The langur has been returned to Mr. Higgins at the zoo," Holmes said with a faint smile. "I believe the creature is quite happy to be back among his own kind, away from the influence of disgraced vicars and ancient incense. Though Higgins tells me the animal now has a singular distaste for anyone wearing a black cassock." When we arrived back at 221B, the familiar sight of our sitting room, the chemical-stained table, the stack of newspapers and the glowing fire, felt like a sanctuary of reason after the distorted madness of Crompton's house. Mrs. Hudson had left a tray of cold woodcock and a bottle of Montrachet upon the sideboard, a sight which reminded me that I had scarcely eaten in 24 hours. Holmes, however, did not head for the food. He went straight to his armchair, picked up his violin, and began to play a low, melancholy air by Chopin. I watched him from across the room, his long fingers moving with effortless grace, his eyes half closed in a state of musical abstraction. "You saved more than a book tonight, Holmes," I remarked, pouring myself a glass of wine. "You saved a man's life and another's reason." The music stopped for a moment. Holmes looked at me, a singular expression in his grey eyes, not of pride, but of a deep, restless curiosity. "I merely solved a puzzle, Watson. The human elements are your department. For me, it was simply a matter of correcting a false equation." The following morning broke clear and crisp, the last vestiges of the great fog having been swept away by a brisk wind from the east. The sunlight, pale but persistent, filtered through the windows of 221B Baker Street, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air, those same humble particles that, in the right light and under the right scrutiny, had brought down a master of deception. Holmes was already up, dressed in his grey tweed suit, looking as refreshed as if he had spent the previous night in a peaceful slumber rather than a life-and-death struggle in a hidden stone gallery. He was occupied with his index volumes, carefully cross-referencing the details of Silas Thorne's history with other cases of monastic crimes he had recorded over the years. "I see the morning papers have already made a meal of it, Watson," he said, gesturing with a toast point toward the Daily Telegraph lying on the rug. "The ghost of the Black Friar unmasked, they call it. Lestrade is given a staggering amount of credit for his swift and decisive action in South Kensington." I picked up the paper and glanced at the headlines. "It is a gross injustice, Holmes. Your name is not mentioned once, save for a brief note stating that you provided technical assistance regarding the chemical nature of the incense." Holmes let out a short, dry laugh. "What does it matter? The public requires its heroes to wear a blue uniform, and Lestrade requires his promotions. I have my reward in the records. Besides, he added, his eyes twinkling with a sudden, sharp intensity, it was a most instructive problem. It reminded me that the most complex deceptions are often built upon the simplest mechanical truths. A hinge, a monkey, and a bit of ancient perfume. It is a recipe for a miracle, provided the audience is sufficiently frightened. I still find it hard to believe that a man of Thorne's intellect would turn to such grotesque methods, I remarked, taking my seat at the breakfast table. Intellect without morality is a dangerous thing, Watson. But intellect wedded to fanaticism is a catastrophe, Holmes replied, leaning back and lighting his first pipe of the day. Thorne did not see himself as a thief. He saw himself as a restorer of divine order. In his mind, the lock on the door was not a legal barrier, but a theological insult. Once a man justifies his actions through a higher power, the common laws of logic and humanity become mere inconveniences to be bypassed. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the bustling street below. The case of the locked door was never truly about a door, Watson. It was about the portals we create in our own minds. Crompton created a fortress of fear, Lestrade created a prison of the obvious, and Thorne created a temple of shadows. My task was merely to open the windows and let in a little common sense. And what of the Codex, I asked. Is it truly as dangerous as Thorne believed? It is a book, Watson, a beautiful, ancient, and exceedingly rare book. Its only power is the power men grant it. To Crompton it was wealth, to Thorne it was a weapon. To me, it was a very effective bait. He fell silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on a hansom cab that had just pulled up to the curb. A tall, thinly clad youth jumped out and began a frantic dialogue with the driver. "You know, Watson," Holmes mused, his voice dropping to that philosophical register I knew so well, "there is a certain beauty in the fact that no matter how carefully a man plans a crime, he is always at the mercy of the microscopic. A hair, a flake of wax, a lateral smear of dust. These are the true judges of our actions. We may deceive our fellows, we may even deceive ourselves, but we cannot deceive the laws of the physical world. They are the only absolute justice we have." The front door bell rang, a sharp, insistent peal that echoed through the house. Holmes's posture changed instantly. The philosopher vanished, and the hunter returned. He straightened his waistcoat, his eyes snapping with a renewed predatory fire. "Ah, if I am not mistaken, that is the young man from the hansom. He has a very particular way of clutching his left side, suggestive of a hidden document of great weight, and his boots are splashed with the red clay of the Hertfordshire lanes." He turned to me, a brilliant, enigmatic smile playing on his lips. "The world is full of locked doors, Watson, and it seems another one is about to be presented to us. Are you ready for further exercise, or has the Black Friar sated your appetite for the inexplicable?" I reached for my hat and cane, my heart lifting at the familiar call to action. "I'm always ready, Holmes." "Excellent," he cried, rubbing his hands together. "Mrs. Hudson, show the gentleman up. I believe we are about to embark on the singular affair of the Hertfordshire inheritance, and if my instincts are correct, it will make our little adventure in South Kensington look like a mere nursery rhyme." As the door opened to admit our new client, I looked at my friend, tall, keen, and eternally restless, and felt, as I always did, a profound sense of wonder that I should be the one to chronicle the exploits of the most singular mind of our age. The capture of Silas Thorne had provided the how and the who of the mystery, yet as the days turned into a week, I found that the why continued to haunt the quiet corners of our Baker Street lodgings. While the legal machinery of London began to grind against the Apostle of the Abyss, Holmes remained unusually preoccupied with the Codex of St. Jude itself. "Mr. Crompton," out of a profound sense of gratitude, had allowed Holmes to keep the manuscript for a few days of scholarly study before it was returned to the high-security vault of the British Museum. It was a cold, rainy evening when I found Holmes hunched over the manuscript, his magnifying glass in hand and a series of blue-lit chemical lamps casting long, distorted shadows against the wall. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic drumming of the rain and the occasional scratch of Holmes's pen as he took notes. "You look as though you are searching for a ghost, Holmes," I remarked, settling into my chair with a book. "In a sense, I am, Watson," he replied without looking up. "Thorne was a fanatic, yes, but even the most disordered mind requires a foundation. He did not merely want this book for its age or its beauty. He believed it contained a divine breath. I have been investigating the margin notes, the scholia, written in a much later hand than the 8th century text. He beckoned me over. Under the magnification, I could see tiny, almost microscopic pinpricks in the vellum, following the curves of certain illuminated letters. "What do you make of those, Doctor?" "They look like the work of an insect," I suggested. "Vellum borers are common in ancient libraries." "A very selective insect, then," Holmes murmured, his eyes bright with intellectual fervor. "These pricks appear only on the pages dealing with the preparation of botanical oils. When overlaid with a specific geometric grid, the same grid, interestingly enough, that Thorne used to navigate the secret passages of Crompton's house, they form a map. A map to what? To the original mother altar of the Black Friars, located somewhere in the desolate reaches of Dartmoor. It seems the Codex was not just a religious text, but a coded ledger for the Order's most dangerous alchemical discoveries. The Kyphe Thorne used was but a crude approximation of a much more potent compound described here, a substance that does not merely mimic death, but allegedly preserves the human faculties in a state of stasis for years. I felt a cold thrill of horror. "Surely you don't believe such a thing is possible?" "Science is merely magic that has been explained, Watson. What Thorne sought was a shortcut to eternity. He intended to use Stevens not as a victim, but as a test subject. Had we been an hour later, the valet would not have been merely silenced, he would have been a prisoner in his own body, a living monument to Thorne's madness." Holmes closed the book with a heavy thud, the ancient leather groaning. It is a dangerous thing when the tools of the chemist are placed in the hands of the mystic. I have advised Crompton that the Codex should be kept under a controlled access mandate. There are truths that the 19th century is not yet prepared to digest. He rose and paced to the window, staring out at the rain-slicked streets. The manic energy of the investigation had faded, replaced by a somber, philosophical weight. "You know, Watson," he said softly, "Thorne's greatest crime was not the theft. It was the arrogance of believing that he alone was fit to wield the secrets of the past. He saw the world as a series of locked doors, and himself as the only man with the key. But he forgot that the most secure lock is often the one that has no key at all, the lock of time and human limitation." Just as he finished speaking, a heavy knocking sounded at the street door. It was too late for a casual visitor, and the rhythm was sharp, syncopated, the unmistakable signal of a messenger in great haste. "The Hertfordshire youth!" Holmes cried, his mood shifting in an instant. The shadow of the Black Friars vanished from his face, replaced by the keen, predatory alertness of the hunter. "He has been waiting in the hallway while we discussed the philosophy of vellum. I believe, Watson, that the aftermath of one case is merely the hook of the next." He turned to me, his hand on the door handle. "Are you ready, Watson? The rain is heavy. The night is dark. And somewhere in the country, a great inheritance is being contested by means that may prove even more baffling than a retractable hinge pin." The door to our sitting room swung open to admit the young man I had observed from the window. He was, as Holmes had noted, a pitiable sight. His coat was a cheap, threadbare garment that offered little protection against the biting Hertfordshire rain, and his boots were indeed caked with the distinctive red clay of the northern lanes. He stood for a moment on the threshold, clutching his left side as if in pain, his eyes darting around our cluttered sanctuary with the frantic energy of a trapped animal. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he gasped, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "I am he," Holmes replied, his voice calm and steady. "And this is my friend, Dr. Watson. Pray, step toward the fire, Mr. Pendergast, for I assume you are the youngest son of the late Silas Pendergast of St. Albans, given the mourning band on your arm and the specific legal crest on the envelope you are attempting to conceal beneath your waistcoat." The youth gasped, his hand falling away from his side. You know of my father's passing? And my name? I know that your father's will has vanished from a room that was observed by 3 witnesses, and that you have travelled 4 hours in a third-class carriage to seek the only man you believe can find it, before the probate court convenes tomorrow, Holmes said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "The rest is mere deduction. But sit, Mrs. Hudson is bringing tea, and you look as though you have not eaten since you left the valley." As the young man collapsed into the chair lately vacated by Alistair Crompton, I could not help but marvel at the seamless transition of my friend's mind. The case of the locked door, which had occupied every fibre of his being for the past 72 hours, was already being filed away into the vast cabinets of his memory to make room for this new puzzle. "It is a strange life we lead, Watson," Holmes remarked, catching my gaze as he waited for Pendergast to find his breath. "One moment we are untangling the medieval delusions of a fanatical monk, and the next we are thrust into the sordid squabbles of a country inheritance. And yet, the thread remains the same. The human heart, with its burden of greed and its capacity for deception, provides the constant in every equation." He turned back to the manuscript on his table, the Codex of St. Jude, which still lay open to the pages of the divine breath. With a decisive movement, he closed the book and wrapped it in a heavy silk cloth. "Crompton will be here in the morning to collect this," Holmes said. "He tells me that Stevens is making a full recovery, though the poor fellow refuses to enter the study unless the sun is at its zenith. It is a small victory, perhaps, but a victory nonetheless. We have restored a piece of history and prevented a madman from turning a house of law into a house of slaughter." "And the title you gave this case, Holmes?" I asked, looking at the notes I had already begun to compile. "The locked door seemed to refer to Crompton's study, but you spoke earlier as though it had a deeper meaning." Holmes stood, his silhouette sharp against the firelight. "The most difficult door to unlock, Watson, is the one the mind closes against the truth. Crompton locked his door with brass and steel, yet the thief entered with a monkey and a hinge-pin. Thorne locked his mind with fanaticism, yet logic found the way in. And now," he gestured toward our new client, "young Mr. Pendergast believes the door to his future has been locked by the disappearance of a piece of parchment." He reached for his heavy ulster and his deerstalker cap, the familiar transformation from philosopher to man of action complete. "The case of the locked door is closed, Watson. We have seen the shadows of the Black Friar dispersed by the light of reason. But the world is wide, and the fog is returning. Somewhere in Hertfordshire, a secret is waiting to be found, and I fancy that the red clay on our guest's boots has a story of its own to tell." I followed him to the door, feeling the familiar stir of excitement that always accompanied the start of a new journey. As we descended the 17 steps to the street, the damp night air of Baker Street met us, smelling of coal smoke and rain. The hansom was waiting, its lamps gleaming like the eyes of some prehistoric beast in the gloom. "Tell me, Holmes," I said, as we climbed into the carriage and the horses' hooves began their rhythmic clatter upon the pavement, "do you ever tire of it? The endless cycle of crime and solution?" Holmes looked out at the passing shadows of London, his face etched with a look of profound, quiet contentment. "Tire of the truth, Watson? Never. The games may change and the players may fall, but the logic remains. As long as there is a problem to be solved and a friend to record the solving of it, I find that life is quite supportable. The carriage turned the corner, disappearing into the swirling mist, leaving the mystery of the locked door behind us as we rode forward into the darkness of the Hertfordshire night, toward another case, another puzzle, and another triumph of the mind over the impossible.